and when we started acting human.
Yeah. So where you're going with this is that when we think about creation myths, the Christian creation myth, the Garden of Eden, is one of the best known examples to all of us because of the time in history and the places that we live. But we're going to talk about other creation myths as well. But where you're going with this is that this is not an arbitrary, fictitious story that was simply made up for entertainment or whatever. It is actually an encoding of what you're arguing are actual historical events, and it's symbolic and there's fictional elements to it, but these things are pointing to something that was very real. And if that general notion is true, there are a few things that have to be true if we're going to come to that conclusion. One is that these stories are not, they are symbolic, but they're not totally fictitious and arbitrary. Two is that they are able to persist and retain that information for long periods of time, despite spreading all over the world. And I think maybe a third would be that, we should see sort of the core essence of this story conserved across creation myths that are different in their details. Is that fair?
Yeah, all of that is very fair.
Okay.
So what my response, I had this kind of wild idea, and I just knew the Christian creation myth.
Yeah.
And so a requirement of this model is that all creation myths also describe this moment of realization. So I just started reading creation myths, which is good to do, even if it's just good to know.
Yeah.
And so there's a surprising thing. So for example, Egyptians, the world comes into being when Atum, the god, the primordial god, says his own name. And so it is also, it's like, okay, there's
in the beginning was the word.
Yeah, it all starts with the word, like in this case would be I am. He spoke his name, Atum. And then the first thing he does is fight a snake. And then
yeah, it's like nobody knows this if you didn't study Egyptian mythology before. Be like, wait a minute, I knew the Adam and Eve story with the snake and the Adam and the apple. You're like, okay, this is strikingly similar in that way.
Yes, and then so China has Nuwa and Fuxi, and so they are the so Nuwa is like Eve, and then Fuxi would be Adam, and they are always drawn with snakes as their torso wrapped around one another. So there's once again there's like a first couple with snakes.
Yeah.
If you read so in North and South America, they have the creation myths tend to involve an emergence. So there's different worlds and they're progressively more human-like.
Okay.
So I think we're in the fourth or fifth one, the current world. But in the third one, Spider Grandma, among the Hopi, Spider Grandma teaches them morals. So you can see, like, once again, there's like a woman, and the change is about morality.
Yeah.
And also venomous animal.
And a venomous animal.
And so
you noticed that motif was coming up all over the world in these creation myths.
Yeah, and so I knew about the stone date hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so I thought, hey, can you get high on snake venom?
Yeah. So before we go there, just for people who don't know, cover very briefly, what is that stone ape theory from McKenna? What does it essentially say?
So his theory is that we have been doing, we've been eating mushrooms for a long time, like 200,000 years. And then it was a gene culture interaction that mushrooms somehow made us more amorous and open. And it was good for passing on genes.
The idea was that psilocybin mushrooms, psychedelic ingestion, precipitated this kind of cognitive shift.
Yes. So not taken seriously. So it's a Joe Rogan theory.
Right.
Is like he's kind of the we should say steward of the theory at this point.
Yeah.
But there is some work among academics to also take it seriously.
Yeah, and then there's probably one of the things that hooks into this is like the book that Brian Murarescu wrote. I talked to him on the very first episode of the podcast. Actually, basically, there's a field called archaeochemistry, and there is evidence to suggest that, at least thousands of years ago, people were drinking psychedelic concoctions, potentially with, alkaloids, not too dissimilar to LSD and things. And those were part of these sort of sacred, secret rituals.
Yeah, and so I definitely want to come back to his book and the Greek
Yeah.
mystery
Yeah.
cults. But yeah, where are we right now?
So let's get back. So creation myths, you notice this motif is all over Egyptian myths, Chinese myths, the Christian myth. And we're just talking about like how common it was. And it always involves a woman and saying I am at the beginning. There is the word, and there's always this
Yeah,
kind of venomous animal around, whether it's a snake or a spider or what have you.
yeah,
All
not
these
not
things are bubbling
always,
around. Yeah.
not always, but it's enough to strike you. So
Yeah.
especially the snake thing just hits
Yeah.
you over the head. So what
Yeah.
like you, I think that like I'm not a particularly nuanced reader of literature, and
Mhm.
yet like here it's just right there. It's in every one of them. There's a
Yeah.
snake.
And so,
Um,
okay. So where did you go from there? You sort of noticed this, you had some of these ideas in your head.
and so I just Googled, can you get high from snake venom? And
Mm.
you totally can. Like you totally can. There's a small literature on this, mostly in India, where they have instead of like they have snake dens, they call them, instead of like an opium
Today.
den. Yeah, to date, there are clinics where people go for snake venom or scorpion venom, like addiction rehab.
What?
It's a real thing. So this was people laughed at me when I posted this on Reddit. It was people hated the snake venom shit. However, there was just this year a famous YouTuber in India was arrested for selling cobras and crates at a rave in India.
What?
Yeah,
Okay,
there
but
is.
hold on, but just tell me, like, what do people actually do? If I'm at the
They
rave and I
take
buy a
a
cobra, what do I do with it?
they take a bite on their tongue.
What? From the cobra?
Yeah,
Like they touch the fang?
yeah. So there's like I have seen footage of there was I link it in one of my pieces, one of my
Like
later
Indian
pieces.
kids at a rave do this on
I don't
purpose.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I don't know, there are snake charmers that's your dealer. Apparently
Oh,
there's a thing. It's a
there's more
thing.
to the snake charmers that meets the eye.
Yeah, so it's good. So a blog is great because you can just kind of write shit.
Yeah.
Um, and so I found a lot of the evidence for snake venom as an entheogen after I wrote it. I just found so you can Google it and it comes right up. But
I
so
see.
for example, the arrest didn't happen. Anyway,
Yeah.
I have much better evidence because it's what I get the most pushback on, and so I
Yeah.
spent a
Yeah.
lot of time
Okay, hold on.
actually.
Just
Go
I'll
ahead.
pause here real quick. I want to make sure I fully understand this. There's people to this day in places like India getting high on snake venom. They will buy a snake on purpose at literally at a rave in some cases, and they
Yes.
touch the fang of the cobra to their tongue. What happens? What do they report? Is it like a euphoria they get? Like what happens?
Yeah, so I actually don't know too well why. So why aren't they dying, for example? So
Yeah.
I don't know if there's like a different diet they give
Yeah.
to these snakes or if they
Yeah.
milk them so much.
Yeah.
I
It
I
could
don't
be a
know
dose dependent
any of
thing. It
that.
could be swallowing it rather than having it injected into your veins. But what do they report as why are people wanting to do this?
So I haven't seen any reports from the raves, and
Yeah.
it's weird. So I have looked for it, but the raves don't report it. There's in the literature from in the scientific literature,
Yeah.
the people mention taking it, and then so there's convulsions, there's sometimes even paralysis, there's feeling sleepy. There's a lot of them report bliss.
Hmm.
There's hallucinations. There's some really interesting reports where somebody who had been addicted to opiates and alcohol for a decade, they took this and then they just went cold turkey
Huh.
off of the other substances, and then they just like every couple months would go get a snake bite.
Wow.
So very
Yeah.
strange.
Roughly speaking, it sounds like maybe something in the ballpark of ketamine or ibogaine or something like that. Like maybe a deliriant or a dissociative of some kind. And it's not, I mean, I'm not an expert on snake venom, but I do know that many of the venoms that have evolved are basically, they're often modified proteins that act, on receptors and at synapses in the brain, and they do have neuro effects. They are that is their evolved function in some cases. So it's certainly not I've had never heard this before I read some of your stuff, but it's at least not a stretch to think that there could be some snake venoms that would have a psychoactive effect.
Yeah, I mean, if I had said like um, toad venom, nobody
Yeah.
would have a problem with this.
Right. Right.
Um, but so there's, for example, there's a Sadhguru is a guru in India with a huge following, millions and millions. And he, at the dedication of some temple, he drank snake venom. And
Yep.
so he like so
Just
there
drink it.
is he drank it. And so his report, he talks about the disassociative effects
Mm,
of snake venom. He talks about all, like disassociating and also the death and rebirth. So he says
yeah.
like snake venom killed me,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
it taught me something more valuable. I mean, some shit to this
Yeah.
effect.
And it's,
It's on my article if you want to see
yeah.
the direct quote.
Yeah. I mean, what's sort of interesting here about, so the idea that to train I into the human mind required some kind of ritual that brought you to the precipice of death, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
When you think about psychedelics and dissociatives, anything from psilocybin to ketamine, on a high enough dose, the essence of the experience is just that. You lose your sense of self, you dissociate from your normal waking consciousness, and then you
Yeah.
come back to it. And the coming back to it and seeing that distinction really leaves an impression on people that never leaves
Yes.
them.
Yeah, and I think of it some like it relaxes your prior
Yes.
is kind of the
Yes.
Bayesian way
That
to
would be
say
the
it.
Bayesian way of talking about that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is still it's not like I disbelieve this because it's like, okay, like I guess people even to this day are doing this in India. Are there any more but if this was a creation myth that was worldwide or that you see in many places and the snake motif shows up over and over again, people must have been doing this in other times and places. What do we know about how often snake venom was being intentionally consumed anywhere else in the world or at any other period of time?
Yeah, so the Greek mystery cults that's another good option. So there's going back the earliest citations I saw was 20 years ago or so. There have been arguments that snake venom was consumed by, say, the Oracle at Delphi and also in the Eleusinian mysteries.
So writings from that time say that.
Yes. So the father of tragedy. I'm blanking on his name. It's like it's not quite Asclepius. It's anyway, it's something like
Yeah.
that. So he um he has a play of the
Aeschylus.
yeah, Aeschylus.
Yeah.
So
So there's an
he
old
has a play.
play.
I believe it's the Libation Bearers.
Okay.
And he talks about how he calls the priestess a dragoness of the Eleusinian mysteries, and she would bite the initiates, and also that she was bit on her breast by some snake, and then would give the initiates milk, and so it
Huh.
was venom and milk mixed.
Wow.
And then he was put on trial for death for profaning the
Because he
mysteries.
gave away the secret, basically.
Yeah, because it's a mystery cult.
You're
Like
not
you
supposed to
can't say
know.
what they do,
Yeah. Yeah.
or else like you're out of the cult. And the way you get out of the cult is they kill you.
Yeah. Nobody talks about
Um,
Fight Club. That's the first rule of Fight Club.
yeah, and so um anyway, there's a guy, Ammon Hillman. He's a PhD in classics, and his dissertation was on this subject. And so he has a few articles where he
Mm,
he says explicitly, like,
I
yes,
see. So,
that he connects it. He says
yeah.
what they were killing him over was that he said it was snake venom. And then
Ah,
also, so you don't want to go off one person's work,
right.
but
Right.
the guy who coined the term entheogen,
Yeah.
he cites that work. So it's
Yeah.
Carl Ruck. He just
Yeah.
says point blank, like, yes, they were throughout the Mediterranean consuming snake
I
venom
see.
as
So
an entheogen.
what's interesting about this is a couple of things tied together here. One, I mean, the fact that there's a record, someone said this and wrote this is interesting in itself. But two, the fact that these were mystery cults and sort of the whole point of these things is you're not allowed to talk about them outside. This simultaneously gives an explanation for why we don't see more of a record of these things,
Yes.
and that it does appear to have happened, at least according to the limited number of leaks we got.
Yeah. So, like, what we have so far is an extremely specific prediction. So basically you need a snake cult that was invented by women that spread the entire world.
Yes.
And you don't expect to find that. So that's
Yeah,
crazy
that's
talk.
wild. That's like, yeah, should be pretty easy to disprove in theory, but unpack that for me. So let's assume that did happen. Well, what is the evidence that such a thing spread throughout the entire world, other than the fact that there's these coincidences with the creation myths containing the same motifs?
So first there's the sapient paradox. So are you familiar with that?
No, no, unpack that.
So the sapient paradox is that you start to see behavioral modernity, let's say 50,000 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not really widespread until 10,000 years
Mm-hmm.
ago or
So
so.
somehow it does spread quickly.
Yeah, so spread independently invented, maybe it's just kind of a
Okay.
natural progression,
Yeah.
but there's a weird thing. So why is it all at once?
There seems to be the sudden
Um,
eruption, sudden evolutionary terms. You're talking about
yeah, and then
thousands of years.
also why is it so late some places? So
Uh,
why so for example, one of the things I cite is this paper that argues against behavioral modernity. So it says behavioral modernity can't be real because in Australia, like behavioral modernity is not exhibited until 7,000 years ago. So it's kind of a gambit.
ah,
It's essentially arguing like, okay, if we think kind of the modern cognition is only 40,000 years old, it's only 40,000 years old in some places. There's a
right.
lot of places
If it
where
arose
there's
40,000 years ago and spread, well, it obviously didn't spread to Australia. So,
yeah,
so they're making the argument that
well,
that can't be the way it happened.
yeah, or a more recent example. So think of the Americas.
Yeah.
So there's evidence of that people were here, undisputed evidence 23,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of evidence that's disputed that goes back a long time. So a lot
Right.
back to
Yeah.
40,000, some back to like
That's
200,000.
yeah. That's an active area right now, right? If people are arguing over how long people have been in the Americas, and it seems to be getting pushed back.
But how old is art in the Americas?
I have no idea.
About 13,000 years old. So there's why isn't there art? And so one thing that people I don't like it when so there's the for a long time there was Clovis first was a kind of a dominant position, and that was that there were no people in the Americas, and then people came over the Bering Strait about 13,000 years ago, and they filled up the continents. And so the
Mm-hmm.
reason that people like that idea um, was that culture actually is quite similar, and so there was something that spread over both continents at that time. And if there were people before that, what happened to them? And also, why weren't they making art? So I would say, okay, there were people there, but maybe they just weren't conscious. Maybe it was the snake cult that spread through,
Huh.
right? And so that's another kind of another continent where you can see something pretty similar happening. Like what we consider
Yeah.
fundamental to human life only seems to be there from like around the Holocene.
Yeah. It's like it's a very loose analogy here, but it's like, the mycelial network can spread far and wide, but then you get these eruptions of mushrooms in certain places. Basically, what you're saying is, according to the view that you and some others hold, humans could have spread all over the place, but not gotten this new ability yet. And then
Yeah.
suddenly, for whatever reason, that thing erupts there because they independently discover the precipitating ritual, or it spreads to them
No, I don't
naturally.
think it was in I think that
You think it
somebody
spread?
discovered it and it spread would be my guess. Because it's for me, I think of in terms of once once it exists, it would tend to spread really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think there's not a whole lot of time for it to get invented multiple times, specifically if there's a lot of similarities
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in between
Yeah.
its
So,
versions.
so if you had people in some location for a long time and some other people show up, they can quickly spread this aspect of culture to them, and then you get the sudden eruption in those people
Yes,
as well.
yes, yeah. I mean, I'm not really making claims about the degree to which
Yeah.
humans would have just wiped like humans would have just wiped out other groups or mixed with them. I mean, I'm sure it's
Yeah.
different in many different places. And also yeah, we'll just see where the genetic stuff leads us. Like that's an empirical question.
Okay,
Let's go back to, so we have kind of hinted at bull roars. I don't know, the myths are similar. They have snakes all over the world. Um, and so I went looking for the best evidence of global cultural diffusion.
okay.
And so what I think is the best evidence is bull roar mystery cults.
What is that? What does that word mean?
So the bull roar is an instrument. You tie a a bone or a piece of wood that's a kind of a slat, and there's a hole in one side. You tie a string to that and then spin it around, and it makes this kind of roaring or whirling sound.
Hmm.
And so I mean, it's just an instrument,
Yep.
but it's used in mystery cults around the world. So already that's kind of weird. Is that why this particular instrument? Like why aren't, like, there's flutes and bells. There's all sorts of instruments you could use. Why is this so often at the center? It's often the secret thing at the center of a mystery cult. And there's a couple other facts that make it strange. So in many places, so in a lot of places, the bull roar has been secularized. It's not really remembered as sacred. So in a lot of parts of Europe, although not everywhere, it's just a child's toy. However, when anthropologists started visiting the world, it's like everywhere they went, there'd be mystery cults with, at the center, there's this feared and respected object that was said to be given by God or created by the first person in their tribe.
Wow.
And very often it was said that it was invented by women. So this is true in Africa and Australia and also in the Amazon. So highly separated continents. And they say it's invented by women, but men now control the sacred object, as well as the political organization of the mystery cult.
Okay.
And if women see the bull roar, they are put to death. So it's just a very strange fact pattern.
Yeah.
That is extremely widely spread. So you can say, like, of course, the bull roar could be invented many times, but there's all of these other things about it.
Okay, so it's a recurring motif, but what is it actually used for ritualistically? What do they do with it?
It's usually said to be the voice of God.
Okay.
Or in many places, it's like a thunder charm. So to bring rain. So connected with rebirth in that way is part of the literature.
Yeah.
But I'm really not interested. So there's a paper about the use of the bull roar among the Khoisan. And there's evidence of them using it. There's rock art of a group of them twirling the bull roar in a cave. And that's dated between 5 and 10,000 years ago. So it goes back a long ways.
Yeah, but I guess like one of the themes that you've been getting at here is that, okay, we're talking about culture, we're talking about ideas, we're talking about ritual. If we think about this like an evolutionary biologist, if I'm an evolutionary biologist and I'm studying birds and lizards or whatever, when I look at phenotypic diversity in the forms of animals, you look for what's different between different lineages, and you look for what's similar. And the things that are most highly conserved are usually the things seen in older last common ancestors, right? Like all tetrapods have 4 limbs because we all shared a last common ancestor that evolved that feature, a really long time ago. And basically what it sounds like you're saying is that when you look at these creation myths and these mystery cults and all of this stuff, these cultures around the world, there's this kind of common core that a lot of their rituals and their mythologies share. And it centers on women being sacred or special in some way, initially commanding or inventing the bull roar or whatever you're talking about. And there is usually some kind of venomous animal like a snake involved. and this realization, this connection to saying I am, or being born or reborn, like all of these things seem to be conserved features that speak to a last common ancestor here.
Yes, yes. And the point I was going to make is that I'm interested in borers from the last common ancestor perspective.
Yeah.
But maybe it is an active ingredient of the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
So the paper one with the Khoisan, they talk about how it could be helpful for creating alternate states of consciousness. Because it's I don't know, it stays at about 40 hertz. And so they make some argument about brainwave stuff like that. So, but I'm more interested in the last common ancestor, culturally speaking. And
so when you look at all of this evidence, you look at all these creation myths, and all of this sort of anthropological, cultural stuff, how far back does that last common ancestor go? What is the date that you come to when you look at when the inferred origin of this may have been?
Yeah, so another reason I love the bull roar is that it's an artifact. So myths, like myths don't leave
it's hard
material.
To date that. Yeah.
But there's bull roars that we can date back to 20,000 years ago in Ukraine. So that's the oldest one that's not really controversial. And so I think, so my model for what happened is that essentially symbolic thought is emerging, and especially among women, I is emerging or forming in a more cohesive state. And that women made rituals where there were altered states of reality or consciousness. And then somebody gets bit by a snake. And then it's like, hey, that is pretty similar to the song and dance we were doing, also produced that effect. And then so you can imagine working in snake bites into the ritual to give it a little bit more punch.
I see. And so it's almost like how, there's certain states of consciousness you can get to by taking acid or psilocybin, or through fasting and food deprivation, through chanting and drumming. Like, people often report that you can get to similar states by different routes.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that they found the snake venom.
They found a catalyst.
And so there was some sort of cult centered around Venus statues. So there's fairly good evidence for that.
Explain what those are for people.
So right into the beginning of behavioral modernity, starting from about 40,000 years ago in Europe, there are these beautiful figurines of women. And that there are almost no depictions of men until like 15,000 years ago. It's all women, and there are hundreds of them distributed throughout from Spain to Siberia.
Yeah.
And so they persist
all over the world, similar cultural
not all over the world. So just from Spain to Siberia. So it's among the Gravettian culture, or it actually starts in the Aurignacian, but 40,000 years ago. And so I think that there's just these memes stewing, and that the earliest evidence of that in relation to snake worship would be about 24,000 years ago. There's the Malta Beret culture, and that's in Siberia. And so there's burials with mini Venus figurines, but there's carved on mammoth tusk. There's 3 snakes that look like cobras. And on the other side is this totally psychedelic spiral carved in this mammoth tusk. So very cool artifact, interpreted as snake worship because this is height of the Ice Age, 24,000 years ago in Siberia. So there probably weren't a lot of snakes.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, well, why?
So what's up with
snakes?
It's just very strange to find this.
It makes sense if they already had that in their culture.
Yes. Yeah. So that's you have the Venus statues and perhaps snake worship back 24,000 years ago.
Yep.
This group, so the Malta-Pareg culture, genetically, these people are called the ancient North Eurasians, ANE. And they are the people that populated the Americas.
Yes.